So says my guest today, one of Britain's most prominent liberal philosophers, Anthony Grayling. From treatment of suspects to personal data collection and police surveillance, he sees a government undermining cherished individual rights. A timely warning or a fundamental misreading of the 21st century balance between freedom and security. Anthony Grayling, welcome to Hard Talk. At his inauguration, President Obama very publicly rejected what he called the false choice between our safety and our ideals. Do you agree with him that it's a false choice?
Yes, I think he's absolutely right about it. What we've seen in the last, in fact, more than 10 years, perhaps the last 25 years or so, from the height of IRA terrorism in this country until now, is the belief that the only way that we can make ourselves secure is to chip away at some of our liberties, because those liberties give too great a margin for people who want to do bad things. And that's a false dichotomy. And I think it's proved to be a dangerous one, because it's led to the situation that we find ourselves in now, in which the whole fabric of our civil liberties is under considerable pressure, perhaps even danger, from the effort to try to make ourselves secure by making ourselves less free.
But there are choices to be made, aren't there? I mean, I notice on the Obama White House website, one of the first things it says is, quote, "The president's highest priority is to keep the American people safe." That suggests that there are choices to be made, there are priorities to be balanced out, and Obama has made his choice.
Well, it's become part of political rhetoric, not just in the United States, but in Europe also, for people to say this, that it is the first priority of government to keep us safe.
Well, that's not just rhetoric, surely. I mean, it is a fundamental statement of what matters to the leaders of democratic countries.
It certainly matters tremendously. It's a very important task of government to keep the people safe, that's true. But the question is it the highest priority of government? And saying that it is goes directly against a current of thought which has its roots in 19th century liberalism in John Stuart Mill, and in 19th century conservatism in Lord Acton, both of whom said that the highest priority of government is to protect our liberties. Now, you might want to argue that you protect our liberties by protecting our security, but when they come into conflict, then you have to ask the hard question.
Well, that's when you get to the choices.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I just wonder, if one plucks out of the air one dilemma facing Obama, it's this. He has decided to continue to use Predator drones to bomb Al-Qaeda, Taliban targets both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, he says that is necessary to safeguard and protect the American people and the people in the wider world. But in terms of liberty and human rights, bombing people from thousands of feet in the air doesn't seem to be doing much for principles of liberty. So do you think he's come down on the wrong side of that particular choice?
Well, if the program that involves use of Predator drones had as an explicit aim the indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations, then yes, absolutely.
But what if it's not an explicit aim, but what if it is recognised as the inevitable collateral consequence?
Well, I mean, this raises a very, very interesting point. Of course, we already have in international law quite a heavy loading against the idea that the fig leaf of pleas about collateral damage are enough to protect this kind of strategy when it causes a huge amount of collateral damage. But I think in principle the point is that there are legitimate uses of weapons in war against military targets if they genuinely are military targets. And there are genuine complaints that one can raise against the use of such weapons if they do cause a tremendous amount of harm. And so if they're causing a huge amount of harm, then the policy has to be reviewed, no question.
Fascinating answer, because what I get in that answer is a sense of the complexity of it all. The more you dig into it, the more complex it gets. And it seems to me your general critique is flawed in the sense that it invites simplicity. In the end, you are saying, yes, there is a choice to be made, and always, in the end, freedom and liberty should trump collective security. And it can never be as simple as that, can it?
Well, you eloquently put the point that I want to argue for, in fact, which is precisely that. The appeal to the fact that things are complex cannot, in the end, stop us from drawing a line somewhere in the sand. And when one does draw that line, that line, as it seems to me, should be very much on the side of civil liberties and human rights. Because in the end, the choice does come down to a very black and white one between sticking to certain sorts of principles about how we think of ourselves as a society and how we treat individual members of society on the one hand, and on the other hand, other goods like our security or our protection, which sometimes come into conflict with that.
Lines in the sand have to be drawn, you say. So when the former Vice President Dick Cheney, who of course politically, ideologically is no great sort of sympathetic friend of yours, when he says, and he says it quite categorically, that lives were saved because of the policies taken in the war on terror, and he's talking about things like the enhanced interrogation techniques, as they call them, Guantanamo Bay, that sort of thing. He says lives were saved. You are saying, don't care. That's immaterial to me. It was wrong, plain wrong, period.
No, I don't think it's immaterial, but I do think that one has to take a couple of steps back and look at it in somewhat more context. And notice this, that one thing a responsible government ought to do is to say to people, look, having a society which is free and open, and in which there is a great degree of individual autonomy so that people can work at building good lives for themselves in that society, involves accepting certain sorts of risks. Among those risks are that we open ourselves to terrorism or to bad people. I mean, it's one of the great contradictions of the liberal dispensation that it allows critics and hostiles sometimes to flourish within the context of that society. And this is a risk that we have to take, because the alternative to it is to say we can make ourselves very, very safe indeed if we lock ourselves all up at home.
But it's easier for you to say that, if I may say so, sitting in the world of academe and philosophizing than it is for a politician, because I look at even liberal politicians. Let's take Nancy Pelosi, for example, leading figure in the Democratic Party in the United States, who it now transpires, having heavily criticized the Bush war on terror policies and waterboarding and all the rest of it in recent months, it transpires that she was informed about these enhanced interrogation techniques in 2002 and 2003 and said very little, if anything, about it at all. Barely a squeak came from her. And maybe that's because she's a politician, and at that time, with America so fearful of another 9/11, she didn't see the possibility of raising her voice. That's politics.
I think this is a problem, isn't it, about our political discourse, that because of anxieties about re-election or anxieties about what the press will say, if you do say, look, you've got to accept some risks.
But it's also anxieties about what the public really think and want. They want to feel protected. They want to know that bad guys are being interrogated to the full extent to get information about ticking bombs or some other threat that may lie out there.
But when the public finds itself under surveillance all the time and finds its emails and its mobile telephone calls being monitored and finds its bank accounts being looked into, then it begins to raise questions about civil liberties. It begins to ask exactly where the balance lies between these two things. And I think if you had a fully informed public awareness of what the trade-offs are, then it's not so clear to me that people would be very happy to start pushing the limits on things like torture.
But isn't one handicap you have entering this argument that you're not fully informed? You are a philosopher, you're a highly esteemed academic, but you're no security expert, and you don't know what the intelligence services know and what they've learned because you're not privy to the information.
No, but what I am prepared to do, however, is to accept that the threat level is very high, to accept that there are genuine dangers posed by very bad people who want to do harmful things.
Sorry to interrupt, but just
to
emphasize my point. I mean, we've just had a report, an investigation from the House of Commons Intelligence Committee into the run-up to the 7/7 London bombings, and they've concluded that the intelligence services are so sorely stretched that they can only surveil, if there is such a word, they can only closely monitor 1 in 20 terror suspects, and that there are well over 2,000 serious terror suspects still at large in the UK, many of whom are not being properly monitored. That's the scale of the problem they have to deal with.
Well, just to put a bit of balance against that, we've also had Stella Rimington, who was head of MI5 here, very recently saying that she thought that the kinds of measures that the government had adopted had gone far too far in the direction of curtailing civil liberties unnecessarily. She, for example, was hostile to and remains hostile to the introduction of, say, ID cards and other techniques of trying to monitor the population. So we've got to balance these two things. If I go back to that point, though, and if I were to accept the implications of the report you just quoted, which is that we do have a serious level of threat, nevertheless, I still think that the argument of principle has to be made. The argument of principle is this, that if we are going to have a society in which we value things like individuals having the freedom to make lives for themselves that they choose, If we want to be a society which isn't, in effect, policed, monitored, watched all the time, surveyed all the time, turned into suspects just in case a few really are going to do bad things, then we have betrayed something. We've betrayed a number of things, in fact, our own best instincts, for one thing. And the history, which for the last several centuries, at any rate, has involved an enormous struggle to achieve these civil liberties in the face of threats like, for example, the threat in 1940 of invasion, which is a much more serious threat than now, where we wanted to defend exactly those liberties that we had fought for. And I think that point of principle is one that's got to be maintained even now when we feel that there are serious threats.
Well, it's interesting because we'll talk specifics about some of the threats you see out there in a moment. But before we get there, I'm fascinated by this idea of betraying our best instincts. Aren't you actually betraying your better instincts to a certain extent? Because your argument requires a very sort of dark view of what government motivation is. I notice in a lot of your writing you refer to government as the faceless they, as in this quote I've taken, they are taking advantage of the misnamed war on terror to increase surveillance and control of society generally. You know, it almost invites a sort of feeling that they are governors and nothing to do with us. But we live in a democracy. They are elected politicians. They are part of us. They have wives and children who run around in the society just as we do. They're not separate from us. They're part of us.
Well, I think it's a very interesting point, this one, because we're just learning at current events that government, in its endeavour to turn us into its servants rather than being the other way around, have come rather short.
Well, you're talking about MPs' expenses,
yes.
and maybe that's an interesting debating point, but I don't think it really gets to the heart of what I'm
but
saying.
It does get to the heart of an interesting point of principle, which is that once people get into a position of authority, once governments find that they have this tremendously difficult task, which politics involves, of, in effect, herding cats, there are so many different demands on them, so many different pressures, that in order to simplify and to make matters easier to deal with and to maximise efficiency, and also to do those things that they think they have to do, otherwise they're not going to be re-elected, like, for example, protect us to the best of their abilities. They begin to do things to dragoon us in ways, and here I'm using they advisedly.
You are, and you're sounding progressively more cynical as this answer continues. Is it right to be so cynical about our elected leaders?
I think it's important to be cynical about our elected leaders on these matters, because you've heard the old saying, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Who is it about whom we are vigilant? It's exactly those people who, having been pressured into the problems that politicians face in government, begin to try to do this act of dragooning us, which is not, in fact, in the best interests of all of us.
But cynicism isn't good for democracy, and if you are too cynical, you begin to see malign intent in all sorts of different projects. So let's go through some specifics. The DNA database, for example. The UK has a more sophisticated DNA database than I think pretty much any other country in the world. You worry about it. Many citizens are delighted about it because it makes them feel that the police have a better chance of catching serial murderers, rapists, many other ne'er-do-wells. What precisely is the problem with the police holding a DNA database?
There are two sorts of problems. There's a practical problem, which is that, of course, this kind of information can be misused or abused, that we have no guarantees that in 10, 20, 30 years' time, an instrument of this kind in the hands of a government of different complexion in a different
but we have no guarantees in a democratic life at all. We have no guarantees that there won't be a coup in 20 years. I mean, we have no guarantees, but the point remains many serious people, and I'm going to quote one, Frank Field, Labour politician, who's not known as an authoritarian sort of guy. He says, I'm in favour of the police keeping records of people like me who are not criminals because I have everything to gain from being part of a national DNA database which could and would catch many murderous suspects.
We do have a guarantee. If there were no DNA database, then you could be guaranteed that your DNA would never be misused or abused, or that you would be wrongfully accused of something.
No, but you could guarantee also that if you or one of your member of your family or a friend were the victim of a terrible crime, the chances of the criminal being caught would be appreciably higher. The statistics show how much the police have used and benefited from this DNA technology.
Well, here again, it's a question of setting that against what's at stake in principle when you do this kind of thing. If you collect DNA from every citizen or from as many citizens as possible, then what in effect you are doing is you're saying we are going to corral our population as if they were potential suspects, as if at some future date we might have a reason for using this kind of
that's where you
information
lose
against
me.
them.
Why are we treating them like potential suspects? I
Well,
mean, everybody has to have a driver's license. Everybody has to pay their taxes, and the tax man has the right to even investigate our bank accounts should he wish to do so. Why do you see such malign intent in national authorities holding our DNA?
Well, here you put your foot exactly on the right pedal, which is that we've got, on the one hand, a whole set of voluntary relationships that we can enter into in our society with different agencies. So I can get a driving license, I can get a passport, I can have a bank account, I can get a credit card, and in each case I've chosen to do this. It may be very inconvenient not to do it, and there may be lots of pressures why I have to do it, but in each case I've entered into a voluntary relationship with a particular agency. What we're now thinking of, and you see the point about the DNA database is that it's not divisible from other things that our government would like to do in the way of making us more secure and better organized, because it becomes part of a central authority, one which, by the way, and this adverts to the practical point, has not been a good custodian of our private data so far, as you know, but centralizing all this information about individuals, not because you or I have done anything wrong, but because we might, or because somebody might. And so all your information and mine has got to be on a computer somewhere, looked after by the government, shared some of this information with private agencies who do work for the government, all in the interests of what? Of policing, monitoring, organizing society maximally efficiently and with great security. And you know, one protection of our liberties is inefficiency.
Well, yeah, I'm still struggling with the sort of philosophical point to this, because tell me, what is the philosophical difference? And I'm just switching from the specifics of DNA to surveillance, which you also don't like, and which, again, Britain is a sort of world leader in the sense that we have more surveillance cameras, CCTV, than any other country on Earth per capita. What is the difference between those carefully labelled, very obvious surveillance cameras in our public spaces and having many more policemen on the beat using their eyes and ears to see what's going on in public spaces? Why are the cameras so much more insidious and dangerous in your view?
Well, again, we leave aside the practical point, by the way, that just as we speak, so a report has been issued saying that CCTV